What does a resilient nation look like? I am Professor Sir Ian Boyd. I'm a professor at the University of St Andrews, and I chair a group for the Royal Society of Edinburgh that is looking at the resilience of nations in the post-COVID future. I'm also a former Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government on food and environment. What we've done in our group is demonstrated that there are a number of key attributes of a resilient nation. The first of those attributes is diversity. That means that systems within nations need to deliver the same outcome via many different routes. Diversity means everything from institutional structures and businesses to supply chains, land use options, and the people that make up the nation. The second attribute is redundancy. This means designing systems in ways which mean that they can flex in response to stress, for example. And that includes creating strategic reserves, for example, of sufficient stocks of food, buffer supply shortages, and to invest in infrastructure with greater safety tolerances. Loss of redundancy is typified by just-in-time supply methods. And when they fall apart, then they tend to fail quite quickly. The third area is connectivity. Connections within and between systems creates buffering against localized stresses. This is illustrated in energy supply grids in particular, which have transnational interconnectors, for example, that can allow power to flow between different national grids, thus allowing them greater localized resilience to cope with short-term power shortages. But we see connectivity also in the food supply system. Those people who claim that we should supply all our food from local production are building a lack of resilience into the system because we are not connected to other sources of supply. The fourth area is inclusiveness, equity, and fairness. Social policies which sustain but also value those in the most vulnerable communities need to be about endowing disadvantaged people with greater power, agency, and justice so that they can create their own resilient solutions. We will not be resilient unless we are all individually resilient. And then fifthly, adaptive learning. Resilience requires us to be able to flex the systems which sustain the structure and function of society in the presence of stresses. Only if we absorb the lessons from those experiences will society evolve to become more resilient. And we're learning this from COVID-19, right, as we speak. We are learning a lot from having gone through the process of having to socially distance and effectively shut down the economy. And when we come back out of that, those learning processes will have built themselves back into the national economic and social system. And then the final attribute is a culture of preparedness. And this relies on the proactive management of resilience in the face of known and unknown risks involving the allocation of responsibilities between national governments, markets, businesses, institutions, and individuals. So this includes having the capacity to monitor system states, the state of the food supply system, for example, or the energy system, and assess the likelihood of future failure so that adaptation can be introduced to head off that system failure. So what should the priority actions be for building national resilience? Well, the first one is to make sure we know where the risks and hazards lie. So we need to build a national risk register and a national risk assessment. Now, those things already exist, but the problem is that even though they do exist, they don't take account of what we call aggregate risk. We can look at individual risks, let's say the risk of energy supply grids failing. And then we can look at another risk, the risk of coastal flooding, for example. And we can look at them all individually and say, well, actually, each of these is pretty serious, but they're not going to happen very often. The trouble is, if you have 50 or 60 of those risks, and they happen once every, on average, say 150 years, then you should expect one of these risks to actually happen roughly every 3 years or so. So we are much more vulnerable than we generally believe we are, and we need to make sure that we understand what those vulnerabilities are. The second priority action is to communicate those risks openly and honestly. I said that we already have those risk registers. Some of them are actually not communicated to people at all. If people don't know what the risks are, they're never going to plan for them. They're never going to make allowances for them. So we need to openly and honestly communicate those risks to the public and to all aspects of public life, from institutions all the way through to businesses and throughout government and to individual households. The third area of action is to develop an inclusive approach to decision making and support on resilience. This is about risk sharing and ensuring equity in resilience decisions that are made. Now, we cannot make decisions about resilience unless we know that everybody is informed about those decisions and everybody is likely to be compliant with them. We can't create huge disadvantage as a result of the process of enacting enacting national resilience, or bringing national resilience to the fore. The fourth area is to create a set of key performance measures for resilience. We need to be able to measure how resilient we are. We need to be able to measure our progress towards resilience, so that we can make sure that if we're not resilient in some areas, we can actually build up our resilience. And then finally, we need to mainstream resilience testing in policy making. And that's for government to do and government to lead, both at national scale and at local scale. Because unless we actually stress test everything government does, from local planning decisions to national fiscal policy against resilience, we will fail to adapt our systemic management of society to create resilience. So in summary, a resilient nation needs to share its risks among all people. People also need to be encouraged not to invoke the moral hazard of saying that it's somebody else's problem. That's often the case, because actually we don't have the tools to manage the resilience ourselves and to create the resilience that we need. And we need to learn not to apply what's called high discounting to risks that are likely to occur quite a long time in the future, and just say, well, actually they're so far in the future, we really don't need to bother about those. We've got to try and avoid that, and we need to invest in resilience. One of the big problems that we probably face is that in order to be a resilient nation, we probably have to invoke certain costs associated with that. In other words, we need to pay certain costs. And that is running against the trend that there has been for the last 4 or 5 decades, at the very least, where the emphasis has been on economic efficiency. Just-in-time supply chains are a classic example of that, where they're driving in economic efficiency. But in driving in economic efficiency, they're also driving in vulnerability to risk and driving out resilience. So there's going to be a cost to resilience, and there may be a strong trade-off between economic efficiency in the short term and resilience in the long term. I'll just finish by saying that the Cambridge philosopher Honora O'Neill has said that we all have rights as citizens, but in having those rights, we all have responsibilities, and those responsibilities are partly delivered through understanding what our risks are and preparing ourselves as much as we can to meet those risks by being resilient. Thank you very much.